in the entire chapter that ruined her reputation, she speaks once. 2 words. In the Hebrew, exactly 2, Hara Anochi, I am pregnant. That is the complete recorded speech of the most painted woman in the Bible across the whole account of the thing that happened to her. 2 words, and then the narrator closes her mouth for the next 20 years of story. And yet, if you turn forward roughly 40 years in the same history, you will find that same woman walking into a throne room in Jerusalem, and the most powerful king in the ancient Near East stands up when she enters. He bows to her, he orders a second seat carried in and placed at his right hand, and she sits down beside him, and the kingdom listens to what she says. The woman with 2 words became the woman who chose the king. Nobody tells you that part. If you grew up hearing this story, you were handed a bath, a rooftop, a beautiful woman, and a warning about temptation, and then the sermon moved on to David's repentance and left her lying in the water. But the text does not do that. The text does something far stranger and far more disturbing, and if you follow it closely, there is a single clause sitting in the middle of verse 4 that almost every sermon you have ever heard skips over entirely. That clause changes who the story is about. Here is what I want you to understand before we go any further. The answer to the question of what really happened to Bathsheba is not a moral about modesty, and it is not a story about a woman who tempted a king. It is buried in a purity law from the book of Leviticus, in a chain of Hebrew verbs where one man is the subject of nearly everything, and in a page of the Talmud where the greatest rabbis of late antiquity try, in writing, to argue that the whole affair technically never happened at all. 3 different traditions looked at this passage, and each of them flinched in a different direction. I want to show you all 3, and then I want to show you the woman that the text itself, when you read it slowly, actually gives you. If you want to walk through this with me, subscribe and turn on notifications so that when the next part of this story goes up, it finds you, and leave a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. I always read them. So let us go back to the spring of the year, to the season when the roads dried out and the armies moved, and to a king who did not go with them. Part 1. The spring the king stayed home. The chapter opens with a sentence that is doing far more work than it looks like it is doing. In the spring of the year, at the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon, and besieged Rabbah, but David tarried still at Jerusalem. Read it again. At the time when kings go out to battle, and the king stayed home. Scholars who work on the books of Samuel have pointed at that half verse for a long time now as a deliberate narrative indictment. It is not scene setting. It is an accusation planted in the first breath of the chapter before anything has happened. The writer is telling you, quietly and without commentary, that the man is standing in exactly the place he should not be standing. Every disaster that follows in the next 2 chapters unfolds in the gap that this one sentence opens. Now hold on to the war, because the war matters more than people usually notice. The army is at Rabbah of the Ammonites, which is the city that sits today underneath modern Amman, in Jordan. Its ancient citadel crowns a high plateau, an L-shaped shelf of rock lifted above the valley, and archaeologists working that mound have uncovered Iron Age fortification walls along its edges. Beneath the citadel lay what the text calls the City of Waters, the lower town built around the springs. So while the story we are about to follow plays out on a quiet rooftop in Jerusalem, there are men in the field, under a wall in range of archers with composite bows, and one of those men has a name we will learn shortly. Here is the detail that gives the whole chapter its shape, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Count the sends. David sent Joab, David sent and inquired after the woman. David sent messengers and took her. She sent and told David. David sent to Joab, saying, "Send me Uriah." David sent Uriah back to Joab carrying his own death warrant. Joab sent and told David the news of the war. The verb runs through this chapter like a nerve. It is the verb of a man who does everything from a distance, who never crosses a room himself, who moves other people the way you move pieces. The king who would not go out to battle spends the entire chapter sending other people out instead, and the first thing he sends for is not a woman, it is information. Part 2. The clause everyone skips. Evening, the king rises from his bed, which by itself should tell you something about the shape of his day, and he walks on the roof of the king's house. Roofs in the Iron Age were not decoration. They were plastered, flat, load-bearing living space. You dried grain up there, you slept up there in the heat, you worked up there. So the king walking on his roof is ordinary. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. Now, before we go one sentence further, I want to tell you what the text does not say, because almost everything the popular imagination knows about this scene is not in the Bible. The text does not say she was naked. The text does not describe her body, not her hair, not her skin, not one physical detail anywhere in the entire chapter. The only thing we are told is that she was beautiful to look upon, and that is reported as David's perception from a distance as the object of his looking. The text does not say she was on a roof. It does not say she was in view of the palace on purpose. It does not tell us her age. It does not tell us what she was thinking, or feeling, or intending, at any point. Every one of those details that you are picturing right now was added later by somebody else, and in part 9 I am going to show you exactly who added them and why. Because the culprit is not a preacher. It is a painter. The Hebrew verb used for what she is doing is rahatz. It is the ordinary, unremarkable word for washing. It is the same verb the text uses 2 verses later when David tells Uriah to go home and wash his feet, and the same verb it uses in the next chapter when David gets up off the ground and washes himself after the child dies. It carries no connotation of display. It is the word you would use for any person cleaning themselves on any evening in Jerusalem. So the king sees a woman washing, and he sends to inquire about her, and the answer that comes back is one of the most quietly ominous sentences in the book. Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Look at how she is identified. She is bracketed by 2 men. Somebody's daughter, somebody's wife. That is not the narrator being casual. That is the narrator handing the king 2 reasons to stop, and the king does not stop. And her father, Eliam, is not a nobody. Turn to the roll of David's elite warriors in 2 Samuel chapter 23, and there, in the list of the 30, you find Eliam the son of Ahithophel the Gilonite. If that is the same Eliam, and I have to be honest with you and tell you that scholars regard this as a plausible identification rather than a proven one, then Bathsheba is the granddaughter of the single most brilliant political mind in David's court. Remember that name, Ahithophel. We are going to come back to him at the very end of this, and when we do, the whole story is going to rearrange itself one more time. Now here is the clause. Verse 4. In the middle of the sentence describing the worst night of her life, the narrator drops in a piece of information that has nothing to do with romance and everything to do with law, for she was purified from her uncleanness. In the Hebrew, mitkadishet mitumata. She was in the process of sanctifying herself from her ritual impurity. That is a technical, legal, liturgical phrase, and it points straight back to the book of Leviticus chapter 15, which lays out the purity regulations surrounding a woman's monthly cycle, the state the later tradition calls niddah, and the washing required at the end of it. Do you understand what the narrator has just told you? She was not bathing to be seen. She was performing an obligation. She was doing precisely what the law of Moses required of an observant Israelite woman. At the time it required her to do it, and the writer of 2 Samuel went out of his way to insert that fact into the middle of the sentence. The first thing we learn about Bathsheba's character from the text itself is that she kept Torah. Scholars generally see that clause doing two jobs at once. The first is exactly what I just described. It establishes her as pious and removes any suggestion that she was doing something improper. The second is colder and more practical. If she has just completed her purification, then she was not already pregnant when the king sent for her, which means that when the pregnancy comes, there is no ambiguity whatsoever about whose child it is. The clause protects her character and destroys David's defense in the same breath. And I want to stop you from picturing this wrong, because the picture that most people have in their heads here is off by roughly 800 years. Do not imagine a mikveh. Do not imagine a stone-cut, stepped, plastered ritual bath. Of the roughly 1,000 ancient ritual baths that archaeologists have catalogued in the land of Israel, not a single one has been dated earlier than the Hasmonean period, which is the 2nd century before Christ. The earliest examples we have, at Jericho, at Qumran, in the upper city of Jerusalem, are all something like 8 centuries after David. Whatever Bathsheba was doing that evening, she was doing it with poured water, probably from a clay jar, almost certainly in a private courtyard behind a mud brick and fieldstone house. It was small and domestic and legally required, and the king saw it from above. Part 3. He sent. He took. I want to slow down now, because the next verse is only about 20 words long in the Hebrew and it is the hinge of the entire episode. Here is what the narrator says. And David sent messengers, and took her. And she came in unto him, and he lay with her. Now watch the grammar, because in Hebrew narrative the grammar is the moral commentary. Vayishlak, he sent. Vayikacheha, he took her. And then he lay with her. 3 decisive verbs in a row, and David is the subject of every single one. The Baylor scholar Diana Garland put it as plainly as it can be put. In her work on this passage, David, not Bathsheba, is the subject of all the action described. She is the grammatical object. She is the thing that is sent for, and taken, and lain with. That is not a modern reading imposed on the text. That is what the sentence is doing in the original language, and it is the same verb, lakach, to take, that runs through the whole moral vocabulary of the Hebrew Bible for seizing what is not yours. There is exactly one clause in that verse where Bathsheba is the subject of a verb, vattavo elav, and she came to him. One verb, and that single verb is the pivot on which the entire modern argument turns. So let me lay out both sides for you honestly, because this is interpretation, and I am not going to hand you a verdict dressed up as a fact. One school of readers points at that verb and says, she came. Nobody dragged her. There is no cry, no struggle, no protest recorded, and the Deuteronomic law in chapter 22 treats the absence of a cry as legally significant. Some serious scholars have argued along these lines. Randall Bailey has read her as a willing partner with political motives of her own. George Nickel suggested that bathing where she could be seen may have been deliberately provocative. Lillian Klein has written of Bathsheba's complicity. These are real academic positions held by real biblical scholars, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. The other school points at the same verse and says, look at the arrangement of power in the sentence. The king does not go to her. The king sends messengers, plural armed men in royal service, to a house near the palace, to summon a soldier's wife while her husband is at the front under the walls of Rabbah. And then they ask the question that the first reading never quite answers. What exactly does refusal look like in that room? What does no mean when it is spoken by a subject to an absolute monarch who has just demonstrated that he can have anyone brought to him? There is one person in this chapter who defies David directly. One man says no to the king's instruction, politely and firmly, and I will introduce you to him in a few minutes. He is dead within 2 weeks. That is the power imbalance the text is describing, soberly, without editorial. It does not use the word rape. It also never once suggests she had the standing to decline. And then the narrator gives her the floor for the only time in the chapter. And the woman conceived, and sent and told David, and said, I am with child. 2 words in Hebrew. Hara Anochi. There is no plea in it, no accusation, no emotion of any kind. It is the barest possible transmission of a fact, from a woman who has just understood that under the law of her own people. An unexplained pregnancy while her husband is away at war carries a penalty that ends with her death. She does not ask for anything. She reports the situation to the only person on earth who has the power to alter it, and the king, who has spent this entire chapter sends again. Part 4. The man who would not go home. David sent to Joab, saying, Send me Uriah the Hittite, and Joab sent Uriah to David. So now, finally, we meet the third person in this story, and I need you to understand who he actually is, because he is not a background character, he is the moral centre of the chapter. First, the word Hittite. Set aside the images that word conjures. This is not a reference to the great Bronze Age Hittite Empire out of Anatolia, which had collapsed generations earlier. In Iron Age Israel, Hittite points to the Neo-Hittite, or Syro-Hittite, peoples of the northern Levant, the successor kingdoms that survived that collapse. He is a foreigner, but a local one, a man from the surrounding world who has attached himself to Israel. And now look at his name, because his name is the single most striking detail about him. Uriah. It is a Yahwistic name. It means, Hugh is my light, or Hugh is my flame. This foreigner carries the covenant name of the God of Israel inside his own name. Whether he took it himself or was given it, this is a man publicly and permanently identified with Israel's God. Second, his rank. Go back to that same roll of David's mighty men in 2 Samuel chapter 23, and read to the very end of the list of the 30. The last name on that roster, the final entry in the honour roll of the men who built David's kingdom with their own hands, is Uriah the Hittite. He is not a conscript. He is one of the king's elite, a man who has almost certainly saved David's life in the field, and his house is close enough to the palace that the king can see into its courtyard from the roof. So David brings him home from the siege, and he tries 3 times to solve his problem quietly. First, he asks him how Joab does, and how the people do, and how the war prospers, which is a conversation the king could have had with any messenger, and then he says, Go down to thy house and wash thy feet. That is the whole plan. Send him home to his wife for one night, and the pregnancy becomes his. And Uriah does not go. He sleeps at the door of the king's house with the servants. The next morning the king asks him why, and Uriah gives him an answer that has been ringing in the ears of readers for 3,000 years. The ark in Israel and Judah abide in tents, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are encamped in the open fields. Shall I then go into mine house, to eat and to drink, and to lie with my wife? As thou livest, and as thy soul liveth, I will not do this thing. Do you hear what has just happened in that room? A foreign-born soldier is standing in front of the king of Israel explaining the discipline of holy war to him. While the Ark of the Covenant is in the field, while the army sleeps in the open, a consecrated fighting man abstains. That is the code. And the man reciting it is the Hittite, and the man who has just broken it in the worst possible way. With this man's wife is the king who wrote psalms about it. So David tries a second time, and a third. He keeps him in Jerusalem another day. He makes him eat and drink at the royal table. He gets him drunk, deliberately, and sends him out again. And drunk, Uriah still does not go home. He lies down with the servants of his lord. There is a question that hangs over this scene that the text refuses to answer, and I want to name it and then leave it exactly where the narrator left it. Did Uriah know? Some readers have always suspected he did, that the whole city knew, that the messengers who fetched a soldier's wife to the palace at night were not invisible, and that Uriah's refusal is not innocence, but a silent, immovable protest. Others read him as simply and completely a man of principle who has no idea, which makes the scene unbearable in a different way. The text does not say. This is one of those places where the writer of Samuel deliberately leaves the interior of a character dark, and anyone who tells you confidently which it is telling you their own reading. What we do know is that the king has now run out of quiet options, and in the morning, he writes a letter, part 5, the letter in his own hand. And it came to pass in the morning that David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. Sent it by the hand of Uriah. The man carried his own death sentence from Jerusalem to the siege lines at Rabbah on foot across the Jordan, for days, folded and sealed, and handed it to his commanding officer. And here is the detail that tells you something about the world these men lived in. David could write it, and Joab could read it, and Uriah, an elite soldier of the 30, could not. That letter travelled safely inside its own victim's hand, because literacy in the 10th century before Christ was a narrow and specialised skill, held by scribes and officials, not by fighting men. The instruction inside was this: set ye Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle, and retire ye from him, that he may be smitten and die. Now watch what Joab does, because Joab is not a passive instrument here, and this moment defines everything that follows between these two men for the rest of their lives. Joab does not follow the order as written. The order as written, a sudden withdrawal leaving one man exposed, would have been obvious to every soldier on the field. So Joab improvises. He assigns Uriah to a unit and sends it against a section of the wall where he knows the defenders are strongest, and he lets the casualties fall where they fall. Several of David's servants die alongside Uriah. Joab spends other men's lives to camouflage the murder of one, and by doing it that way he makes himself not the king's tool, but the king's partner, holding a secret that he will still be holding decades later. And then he briefs the messenger, and this is one of the most brilliantly written small scenes in the Hebrew Bible. Joab tells him, report the battle, and if the king gets angry, if he demands to know why you advance so close to the wall, if he says to you, why did you go so near unto the city when you fought? Knew ye not that they would shoot from the wall? Who smote Abimelech the son of Jerubbesheth? Did not a woman cast a piece of a millstone upon him from the wall, that he died in Thebez? Why went ye nigh the wall? That is a reference to an event in the book of Judges chapter 9, generations earlier, when the warlord Abimelech was killed beneath a besieged tower by a woman who dropped a millstone on his head. It is the standing military proverb for the stupidity of getting too close to a fortified wall. Joab is coaching his messenger to expect a tactical dressing down, and then he adds the line that gives the game away. Then say thou, thy servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. Joab knows. Joab knows that the moment the king hears that one name, the tactical objection evaporates. He has correctly worked out precisely what his king actually cares about, and he has built the report to deliver it, and David's answer, when the messenger arrives, is the coldest sentence in the chapter. Let not this thing displease thee, for the sword devoureth one as well as another. do not let it trouble you. That is what the king of Israel sends back to his general about the deaths of his own soldiers, and about the murder of the man whose name means, 'The Lord is my light.'" And now, at last, after 18 verses in which she has said 2 words, the narrator returns to the woman. "And when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah her husband was dead, she mourned for her husband." The Hebrew there uses the language of formal lamentation, the ritual mourning called mispad, the recognized public observance owed to the dead. And that is all we are told. Not whether she suspected, not whether she grieved beyond the ritual, not one word of her interior. The narrator, who has just given us a page and a half of David's manoeuvring in fine psychological detail, gives Bathsheba's widowhood a single verb and moves on. "And then, when the morning was past, David sent and fetched her to his house, and she became his wife and bare him a son." And here it comes, the verdict. The last words of chapter 11, and the writer steps out from behind the narrative for the only time in the whole episode. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Read that carefully. Not the thing that they had done, not the thing that had happened, the thing that David had done. The narrator has watched this entire chapter unfold, and when the moment comes to assign responsibility, he assigns it to one man, by name, and to nobody else. That is not my interpretation. That is the sentence. Part 6. "The Ewe Lamb. And the Lord sent Nathan unto David." Sent. The verb comes back one last time, and this time the king is on the receiving end of it. What Nathan does next is a piece of prosecutorial theatre so effective that people who have never read the Bible know it anyway. He does not accuse. He brings the king a legal case, of the kind an Israelite monarch was expected to judge personally. "There were 2 men in one city," he says, "one rich and one poor. The rich man had exceeding many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing, save one little ewe lamb, which he had bought and nourished up. And it grew up together with him, and with his children. It did eat of his own meat, and drank of his own cup, and lay in his bosom, and was unto him as a daughter. And a traveller came unto the rich man, and he spared to take of his own flock, but took the poor man's lamb, and dressed it for the man that was come to him." Now before we get to David's reaction, I want you to notice what Nathan has just done to the 3 people in this story, because it is the clearest window we have into how the tradition that produced this text understood the events. Uriah is the poor man, who owned one thing and loved it. David is the rich man, who owned everything and took the one thing anyway. And Bathsheba is the lamb, not a temptress, not a partner, not a co-conspirator, a creature with no capacity to consent, cherished, taken and consumed. The prophet who has been sent by God to deliver the divine assessment of this affair chose that image. And I want to be careful here and say plainly that a parable is a rhetorical instrument, not a legal transcript, and it is built to provoke a specific reaction from a specific listener. But it is an image chosen by the text itself, and it is not a neutral one. And David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, "As the Lord liveth, the man that hath done this thing shall surely die, and he shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity." Fourfold, he is quoting the restitution law from the book of Exodus chapter 22, which requires 4 sheep for a stolen sheep. The king pronounces sentence on himself and does not know it. And Nathan said to David, "Thou art the man." There is a very old and very widespread reading which takes that fourfold restitution and maps it onto the 4 sons of David who die violently or prematurely across the rest of the history. The infant of this chapter. Amnon, murdered by his brother. Absalom, killed in the oak. Adonijah, executed on Solomon's order. It is a haunting pattern, and it may well be what the writer intended, but I have to be straight with you about its status. The fourfold restitution is in the text. The mapping onto those 4 sons is an interpretive reading developed by later commentators, and the narrator never once tells you to make that connection. Take it as a possibility, not as a fact. What follows is the judgment oracle, and it is severe. The sword shall never depart from thine house. I will raise up evil against thee out of thine own house. Thou didst it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel, and before the sun. And David said unto Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Now I want to point at the shape of that whole scene, because it is the single most important structural fact in this entire episode. And it is the one that almost never survives into the sermon. Nathan indicts David. He indicts David for taking the lamb, and for the killing of Uriah with the sword of the children of Ammon, and for despising the word of the Lord. He indicts him at length, in specific terms, in the name of God. And in that entire oracle, Bathsheba is not accused of anything, not a word. She is not rebuked, not warned, not called to repentance, not named as a participant. She appears in the divine judgment only as the thing that was taken, and that is consistent right through the canon. Generations later, when the book of 1 Kings delivers its final summary verdict on David's reign, it says that he did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, and turned not aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, save only in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. Save only in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. That is the permanent record. Not the matter of Bathsheba, the matter of Uriah. The Bible files this crime under the name of the murdered man, and it never, at any point, in any book, blames the woman. Hold that thought, because in about 20 minutes I am going to show you a tradition that could not live with it. Part 7. 7 days, and the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife bare unto David, and it was very sick. Even here, even now, after she has been brought to the palace and married, the narrator still calls her Uriah's wife. He will not let the reader forget. What follows is one of the strangest and most humanly precise passages in the books of Samuel. David besought God for the child, and fasted, and went in and lay all night upon the earth. The elders of his house came to raise him from the ground, and he would not, neither did he eat bread with them. 7 days. A king lying on the floor of his own house, refusing food, refusing his servants. For 7 days. And on the 7th day the child died. And his officials are afraid to tell him, because they reason, if he did this while the child was alive, what will he do when he hears the child is dead? He might do himself harm. And David sees them whispering, and he asks, Is the child dead? And they say, He is dead. Then David arose from the earth, and washed and anointed himself, and changed his apparel, and came into the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he came to his own house, and they set bread before him, and he did eat. And his servants cannot make sense of it, and he explains himself in a line that has comforted grieving parents for 3,000 years. While the child was yet alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, Who can tell whether God will be gracious to me that the child may live? But now he is dead, wherefore should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. It is genuinely moving. It is the most emotionally transparent David ever gets. And I want you to sit with the thing that is missing from it, without me putting words in your mouth. Across those 9 verses, the text records the father's fasting, the father's weeping, the father's lying on the ground, the father's reasoning, the father's theology of grief. The mother of that child is not mentioned once. She is in the palace. It is her son, and the narrator, who has just given us the interior weather of David's mourning in extraordinary detail, gives us nothing of hers. Whether that silence is the writer's indifference, or the writer's deliberate technique, or simply the shape of ancient Near Eastern court narrative is something scholars argue about. But the silence is real, and by now you will have noticed that it is the most consistent feature of her entire portrayal. And then, one verse later, something shifts, and David comforted Bathsheba his wife, and went in unto her, and lay with her. His wife. For the first time in the entire account, the narrator drops the formula. Not the wife of Uriah, Bathsheba, his wife. And he comforted her, which is the first time in this story that anything is done for her rather than to her. And she bare a son, and he called his name Solomon, and the Lord loved him. And he sent by the hand of Nathan the prophet, and he called his name Jedediah, because of the Lord. Jedediah, beloved of the Lord, the prophet who came to pronounce judgment on this house, comes back to give the second child a name that means God loves him. And there is a small textual wrinkle right there that is worth knowing about. The Hebrew manuscript tradition preserves a variant at that verse. The consonantal text as written reads, "And she called his name Solomon." The text as traditionally read aloud says, "And he called his name Solomon." Scribes preserved both. It is a tiny thing, 3 letters, but it means that one strand of the tradition gave Bathsheba the naming of her son, which is the mother's privilege throughout the Hebrew Bible, and another strand gave it to David. And while we are correcting the record, let me clear up something that almost everybody gets wrong. Solomon was not her second child. Turn to the genealogy in 1 Chronicles chapter 3, and you will find listed as born to David in Jerusalem of Bathsheba, the daughter of Amiel, 4 sons: Shemaiah, Shobab, Nathan, and Solomon. 4. The woman who appears in 2 Samuel as a silent object, mourned once and comforted once. Went on to bear the king 4 sons, one of whom inherits the throne, and another of whom, Nathan, becomes the ancestral line that the Gospel of Luke traces down to Jesus. She is not a footnote in this dynasty. She is, from this point forward, its centre of gravity. And that is where the text leaves her. For roughly 40 years, she vanishes from the narrative entirely. When she comes back, everything has changed. But before we get there, I need to show you what happened to this story after it was written, because the next 1,000 years of tradition looked at what you have just heard and could not bear it. Part 8. The verdict the sages tried to overturn. Everything I am about to tell you now is tradition, not scripture. I am going to be very careful about the seam, because it matters. What follows is not in the Bible. It is what came after, when later generations of readers who loved this text and were bound to it ran into the same wall you have just run into and tried to find a way through. Open the Babylonian Talmud to the tractate Shabbat at page 56. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani said that Rabbi Yonatan said, "Anyone who says that David sinned is nothing other than mistaken." Read it again, because it is astonishing. Anyone who says that David sinned is mistaken. This is not a marginal opinion scrawled by an eccentric. This is in the Talmud, in the standard text, attributed to named sages. And it is arguing that the plain meaning of 2 Samuel chapter 11 is wrong, and the argument they build to support it is remarkable in its ingenuity. The claim runs like this. Anyone who went out to a war waged by the house of David wrote his wife a conditional bill of divorce, a get, before he left. The purpose was humane and practical. If a soldier disappeared in battle and no body was ever found, his wife would otherwise be trapped for life, unable to remarry, because under Jewish law a woman whose husband cannot be confirmed dead cannot be released. The conditional divorce solved it. If he did not return, the divorce took effect retroactively from the day he marched out. Now follow the logic to where it goes. If Uriah wrote such a document, and Uriah did not return, then the divorce was retroactively valid from the moment he left for Rabbah, which would mean that on the night the king sent for her, Bathsheba was not, in the technical legal sense, a married woman at all. No married woman, no adultery. The capital charge evaporates, and the motive behind that argument is not hidden, and I do not think the sages who made it would have denied it. The line of the Messiah runs through this bed. The house of David, the promise of an eternal throne, the whole architecture of Jewish and Christian hope descends from the child born of this union. To leave the story standing as written is to say that the messianic line begins in a crime, and there were rabbis who could not let that stand. But here is the thing I most want you to see, and it is the reason I trust this tradition even when I disagree with it. The tradition preserved its own objection. The Tosafot, the medieval commentators whose notes sit on the same printed page as that Talmudic passage, point out that according to the Mishnah in Tractate Gittin, a conditionally divorced woman is still treated as a married woman for all intents and purposes until the condition is actually fulfilled, which means the conditional divorce does not clear David at all. The counter-argument is printed directly alongside the argument. Judaism did not delete the objection, it bound it into the book. There is more, and it gets stranger. Turn to the tractate Sanhedrin, page 107. There you will find the tradition that David himself asked for this, that he prayed the words of Psalm 26, "Examine me, O Lord, and prove me," and effectively challenged God to test him, as he had tested Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and that God accepted, and warned him in advance, and the test came anyway, and he failed it. In that account the encounter is arranged, down to the detail of a bird that David chases which leads him to the place where he sees her. Same passage, same page. One of the most extraordinary lines in all of rabbinic literature about this woman. Bathsheba, daughter of Ewe Lamb, was designated as fit for David from the 6 days of creation. She was always meant to be his, from before the world was made. But, the passage continues, she came to him through anguish, and he partook of her unripe, before the appointed time. Before she was ripe. It is a fruit image, and it is doing something very peculiar and very human. It is trying to hold two things at once, that the union was providential and that the taking was wrong, and it refuses to release either one. Josephus, writing for a Roman audience at the end of the 1st century, handles it differently again. He keeps the affair, he does not whitewash it. And he calls David a man righteous by nature, who nevertheless fell into grave error, overcome by the woman's beauty and unable to restrain his desire. Notice the shift. In Josephus, the king is a good man ambushed by beauty, which softens the premeditation that the biblical text is at pains to establish. And Josephus goes further in the other direction as well. In his retelling, Bathsheba sends to the king asking him to contrive some way of concealing what has happened, since under the ancestral laws she was liable to death as an adulteress. In the Bible she sends 2 words reporting a fact. In Josephus, she sends a request to help cover it up. That is a real and consequential change. Made by a Jewish historian writing 300 years before the Talmud, and it is the earliest step on the road that ends with the seductress of the paintings. So here is where we stand. The canonical text blames David alone, names the crime after Uriah, and never accuses her. The later tradition, out of love for the messianic line, went looking for a legal escape hatch, and simultaneously began quietly transferring a little agency onto her, and what happened over the following 1500 years is that the escape hatch stayed in the library, and the transfer of agency escaped into the churches, and it did not travel as an argument, it travelled as a picture. Part 9. the painting that replaced the text. I told you at the start of this that the culprit was not a preacher. Here is what I meant. Go and look at how Western Christian art has depicted this scene across the whole history of European painting, and you will find something close to unanimity. Bathsheba is nude. She is frequently at the centre of the frame, lit, posed, sometimes attended by servants, sometimes looking directly out at the viewer. She is available. In the manuscript tradition of the later Middle Ages, illustrated illuminations of a bathing Bathsheba were placed beside Psalm 51, the great penitential psalm associated with David's repentance, so that for generations of readers the image of the naked woman was literally bound into the page where the king confesses his sin. Jean Baudichon's illumination for a French royal book of hours at the very end of the 15th century is among the most overtly seductive images of her ever produced. Hans Memling painted her stepping from the bath, with David watching from a balcony above, and in 1654 Rembrandt painted the version most people carry in their heads without knowing it. A seated nude holding a letter, her face heavy with something like resignation or dread. That painting is a masterpiece, and it is also an invention. There is no letter in 2 Samuel. Rembrandt put a summons in her hand because he needed to show you her decision, and the Bible does not record one. Artemisia Gentileschi painted her repeatedly in the 1630s and 40s, and her versions shift the figure further still, towards something more like an active participant. Marc Chagall, in 1963, broke the pattern entirely and painted them as a tender couple. Set every one of those canvases beside the actual chapter, and the contrast is almost comic. The chapter contains no description of her body. None. The scholarly resource Bible Odyssey, run by the Society of Biblical Literature, states it flatly. The text does not tell us whether Bathsheba was naked or clothed, alone or with others, innocently or inappropriately on display, and the artistic choice to render her nude can function to shift the blame for the king's adultery from David onto her. That is how a doctrine gets taught without a single sermon being preached. You hang the picture. And this is where the modern argument sits, and I want to lay it out as an argument, because that is what it is, and not as a verdict, because it is not one. On one side stand scholars who read deliberate complicity, or at least ambiguity in her conduct. On the other stand those who argue that what the text describes is a coerced encounter in which meaningful refusal was not available. Phyllis Tribble, in her landmark study of the abused women of the Hebrew Bible, wrote a line that captures the reception history better than anything else I have read. David is judged and forgiven. Bathsheba is victimized and forgotten. Cheryl Exum coined the phrase that Bathsheba was raped by the pen, meaning erased as a subject by the very narration that recorded her. Richard Davidson, working on the legal categories in the Torah, argued that what the text describes falls under what the law treats as power rape, where accountability lies entirely with the one who holds the power. And this stopped being purely academic quite recently. In October of 2019, at a Southern Baptist conference in Dallas convened specifically on the church's handling of abuse, the advocate Rachel Den Hollander responded to a speaker who had categorized David's sin as fornication with a sentence that went around the world, "David raped." It's important we get that right. Others pushed back hard, warning that the text does not use the word and that reading it in is anachronism. That argument is still going on in churches right now, and I am reporting it to you as reception history rather than taking a side in it. But there is a third position, and it is the one I find most honest, and it comes from the literary critics rather than from either camp. Meir Sternberg, in his study of biblical narrative technique, made this very chapter his central example of what he calls gapping, the deliberate withholding of information to force the reader to fill the space. The writer of Samuel knew perfectly well how to give you a character's interior. He does it for David constantly. He does it for Uriah. He does it for Joab. And with Bathsheba, on the most consequential night of her life, he shut the door. Sarah Koenig, who has written 2 books on this woman, puts it beautifully. Bathsheba, she says, is given dry bones by the narrator, and it is left to the reader to flesh out her character. And the reader always does. Every generation has filled that gap with whatever it already believed about women, and then read its own answer back out of the Bible and called it scripture. The seductress is a filling. So, in fairness, is the wholly passive victim. What the text actually gives you is a woman whose inner life was withheld, and a man whose guilt was stated out loud. And then, 40 years later, the same writer opens the door and lets her speak. Part 10. The Oath Nobody Wrote Down. 1 Kings, chapter 1. Now King David was old and stricken in years, and they covered him with clothes, but he gat no heat. It is a brutal opening. The man who has dominated 400 pages of narrative, who sent and took and was obeyed by everyone, cannot get warm. His servants find a young woman, Abishag the Shunammite, to lie beside him and keep him alive, and the text notes carefully that the king knew her not. He is failing, and everybody in Jerusalem can see it. And into that vacuum steps Adonijah, David's oldest surviving son, who exalted himself, saying, "I will be king." And he prepared him chariots and horsemen, and 50 men to run before him. He gathers Joab, the same Joab, still holding the same secret, and Abiathar the priest, and he holds a sacrificial feast at En-Rogel, just outside the city, with all his brothers invited. All of them except one. He does not invite Solomon. And the prophet Nathan, who has been waiting in this narrative for 40 years, moves, and notice who he moves to. He does not go to David, he goes to Bathsheba. Hast thou not heard that Adonijah the son of Haggith doth reign? And David our Lord knoweth it not? Now therefore come, let me give thee counsel, that thou mayest save thine own life, and the life of thy son Solomon. And the plan he proposes is a piece of pure political stagecraft, in 2 stages. She will go in to the king first and speak. Then, while she is still speaking, Nathan will come in behind her and confirm every word. 2 independent witnesses arriving in sequence on an old man who can no longer verify anything for himself. And she goes. And the woman who spoke 2 words in 2 Samuel delivers a speech. She bows. She addresses him with full court protocol. And then she says this: "My lord, thou swearest by the Lord thy God unto thine handmaid, saying, Assuredly Solomon thy son shall reign after me, and he shall sit upon my throne. And now behold, Adonijah reigneth, and my lord the king knoweth it not." She names the guest list. She names who was not invited. And then she does the thing that a professional would do. She tells the dying king what his own legacy depends on. "And thou, my lord, O king, the eyes of all Israel are upon thee, that thou shouldest tell them who shall sit on the throne of my lord the king after him." And then she names the stake, and it is the sharpest line she ever speaks. "Otherwise it shall come to pass, when my lord the king shall sleep with his fathers, that I and my son Solomon shall be counted offenders." Counted offenders. She is telling him plainly that the moment he dies, she and her son are dead. She has done the political arithmetic. In an ancient Near Eastern succession, a new king eliminates rival claimants and their mothers as a matter of routine housekeeping. She is not pleading, she is briefing. Now, here is the buried thing in this chapter, and it is genuinely one of the great unresolved puzzles of the books of Kings. That oath. "Thou swearest by the Lord thy God unto thine handmaid that Solomon thy son shall reign after me." Go back and look for it. It is not there. Nowhere in 2 Samuel, nowhere in the preceding narrative, is any such oath recorded. the reader has been present for the entire reign, and has never once been told that David promised the throne to Solomon. So the scholars line up in 3 places, and all 3 are respectable. 1. The oath happened privately, and the narrator simply never recorded it, which is entirely possible in a text that compresses decades. 2. It was recorded in a source that has not survived. 3. And this is the reading that makes the hair stand up on your arms, there was no oath, and Nathan and Bathsheba invented it, between them, and walked it into the bedroom of a man too far gone to remember whether he had said it or not. I want to be precise, the text does not say which. David affirms the oath, swears it again, and acts on it immediately. But the same chapter has told us 3 times that the king no longer knows what is happening around him. This is a genuine scholarly debate, and I am not going to resolve it for you. What is not in doubt is what happens next. David gives the order. Solomon is put on the king's own mule, taken down to the Gihon spring, and anointed with oil from the sacred tent by Zadok the priest. And the trumpet sounds, and the city erupts, so loudly that Adonijah's guests at En Rogel hear it from a mile away, and the feast breaks up in terror. The woman who spoke 2 words has just chosen a king. Part 11. A seat at the right hand. There is a coda, and it is the strangest scene in her whole story. David dies, Solomon is on the throne, and Adonijah, the defeated claimant, spared and living quietly, comes to Bathsheba with a request. He wants Abishag the Shunammite, the young woman who had warmed his father's last nights, given to him as a wife, and he frames it as a small consolation, a modest thing for a man who lost everything. And Bathsheba says, I will speak for thee unto the king. Now, in the political world of the ancient Near East, possessing a former king's woman is not a romantic matter. It is a claim. Absalom made exactly that claim publicly during his rebellion. Every adult in Jerusalem understood the grammar of it. So the question that commentators have argued over for centuries is simply this. Did she know? Was she a naive conduit, carrying a doomed request without understanding it? Or did she understand it perfectly, and carry it in deliberately, knowing exactly what her son would do when he heard it? Some older commentators read it as an innocent errand about a love affair. Others point out, reasonably, that the woman who executed Nathan's 2-stage plan flawlessly in chapter 1 is not a woman who fails to recognize a bid for the throne when one is handed to her. The text, once again, does not say. It has never once told you what she was thinking. But watch what happens when she walks in. Bathsheba therefore went unto King Solomon, to speak unto him for Adonijah. And the king rose up to meet her, and bowed himself unto her, and sat down on his throne, and caused a seat to be set for the king's mother, and she sat on his right hand. Stop there! Solomon, at the height of his power, stands up. He bows to her. He orders a throne carried in, and placed at his right hand. That is not a son being affectionate. That is a protocol, and it has a name. The Hebrew Bible calls the office Gevira, the Great Lady, the Queen Mother of Judah. And in the kingdom of Judah, uniquely, the Great Lady was not the king's wife. She was the king's mother. That is the structural key to everything you have just watched. A wife in that court was one of many, and had no standing of her own. A mother had one son on the throne, and no rival, which is why Bathsheba had no power at all in 2 Samuel, and enormous power here. The evidence for the office is scattered, but consistent. Later in 1 Kings, King Asa removes his grandmother Maacah from being Queen Mother, which tells you it was a position that could be held and formally taken away. The prophet Jeremiah addresses a warning jointly to the king and to the Queen Mother. When Jerusalem falls, the Babylonians deport the king's mother alongside the king himself, as a person of state. And the historian who compiled the Book of Kings names the mother of nearly every king of Judah, one after another, reign after reign, which is not something you do for a private family detail. Scholars have compared the office to parallels elsewhere in the ancient world. The Tawananna of the Hittites, the mother of the king in Neo-Assyrian records, and the debate over how formal and how powerful the position actually was is still live. Some, like Zephrira ben Barak, tie it to a real role in securing succession. Others, like Susan Ackerman, argue for a religious dimension. That is scholarship, not scripture. And I flag it as such. But whatever the office was, Bathsheba is the first woman in the history of the monarchy to hold it, and the throne room bows when she comes in. As for Adonijah, Solomon hears the request and reads it exactly as a bid for the crown, and has him killed that same day. 2 more footnotes, and then I am going to let this rest. When the chronicler retold the history of David centuries later, he cut the entire episode. No bath, no Uriah, no letter, no prophet, no dead child. His David is spotless. Bathsheba survives in Chronicles only as a name in a genealogy. Bathshua, the daughter of Amiel, and the 4 sons she bore. The story we have been following was so difficult that one biblical writer simply removed it, and yet it survived anyway, because another writer refused to. And then, 1,000 years after her death, she appears one last time in the opening lines of the New Testament. Matthew, building the genealogy of Jesus, lists 4 women from Israel's history alongside Mary, and when he reaches this one, he does not use her name. And David the king begat Solomon of her that had been the wife of Urias, of her that had been the wife of Uriah. Scholars have argued for a very long time about why those particular women are in that list, and what the 4 of them are supposed to have in common, and there is no consensus, so I will not pretend to give you one. But that phrasing does one thing beyond dispute. At the fountainhead of the Messianic line, in the first paragraph of the Christian scriptures, the murdered Hittite's name is still there. The tradition tried to divorce her retroactively. The chronicler tried to delete the whole affair. The painters tried to make it her fault. And the gospel opens by mentioning Uriah. So what really happened to Bathsheba after David took her? She buried a husband she may or may not have known was murdered, and a son she was never permitted to mourn on the page. She was written about for 3,000 years by men who could not decide whether she was a victim or a temptress. And she was painted naked by half of Europe on the strength of a chapter that never once describes her body. And then she outlived the man who took her. She raised the son who inherited, she recognized the coup before the court did, she walked into a dying king's bedroom with a claim nobody else could have made, and she came out of it having decided who would rule Israel. The text takes her voice, and then, 40 years later, gives it back, and the first thing she does with it is save her own life and put her son on a throne. That is not a footnote in the story of David. That is the story of how the house of David survived at all. But there is one thread in all of this that I deliberately left hanging, and it is the thread that turns this whole account into something even darker. Her father was Eliam, and if Eliam was the son of Ahithophel, as the role of David's mighty men suggests, then the man who advised the king, whose counsel the Bible says was regarded as though a man had inquired of the word of God himself, was Bathsheba's grandfather. He sat in David's court through all of this. He said nothing. And then, years later, when Absalom raised his rebellion, that same brilliant old counselor walked away from David and joined the revolt, and the first advice he gave the son was to take his father's women. Publicly, on the roof of the palace, in the sight of all Israel, the roof. And when his counsel was finally rejected, he went home, set his house in order, and hanged himself. Nobody in the Bible explains why Ahithophel turned. But the tradition has an answer, and it has to do with a girl who was taken while her husband was at the war. That story begins exactly where this one ends, and I will tell it to you next time. Until then, read it slowly. It is stranger than they told you.